Hello, welcome to this Christmas Carol revision session in which we're going to focus on Ebenezer Scrooge. Let's start with Ebenezer Scrooge's name. Nowadays, Ebenezer might seem an unusual name, but as writer and critic David Lodge said, in a novel, names are never neutral. They always signify, if it is only ordinariness. It will likely be no accident Dickens chose to name his protagonist Ebenezer Scrooge. Ebenezer has its roots in the Bible and is a name that occurs 3 times. First, as the place where, in the first book of Samuel, Israel was defeated by the Philistines. At the time of this battle, Israel was infected with the worship of idols and neglected offerings to the Lord, not dissimilar to the start of A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge worshipped golden idols and failed to fulfill his role as a charitable Christian gentleman. The second time we see the name Ebenezer in the Bible is as a place of lamentation. Lamentations are expressions of grief or sorrow. 20 years after their defeat at the hands of the Philistines, Israel came to accept that they must stop worshipping false idols and instead worship the Lord only. Hearing the Israelites had travelled to Mizpah, where they could pray to God, the Philistines decided to head to the same place and go up against them. The Israelites begged Samuel to pray to God to spare them from the wrath of the Philistines. Samuel offered a lamb as a sacrifice to God and called out in prayer. The Lord answered their prayers, and the Israelites were saved. We might like to consider how this mirrors Ebenezer buying the biggest turkey possible and giving it to the Cratchits at Christmas. The final place we see Ebenezer mentioned is as a place of victory. As the Philistines headed to Mizpah to challenge Israel, a great thunder rolled out, scaring the Philistines. This state of dismay allowed Israel to become victorious against the Philistines. To commemorate the victory, Samuel set a stone between Mizpah and Shen. Samuel named the stone Ebenezer, and on the stone read the words, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." The Ebenezer stone is set as a symbol to remind people that worshipping anything other than God can only lead to failure. If we recognise the error of our ways, repent, and return to God, God will help us live a fruitful life. The narrative arc Ebenezer Scrooge follows is very similar to the story relayed in the first book of Samuel. So Ebenezer is an interesting choice of first name, but we might also like to consider the choice of the surname Scrooge. And the surname Scrooge has more creative roots. Dickens wrote this story knowing it would be read aloud in many households across the country. As a result, he knew the sounds of names could play a big part in characterization. Scrooge acts almost as a blend of 2 separate words, scrouge and gouge. Scrouge means to squeeze or to press, and was a word in common usage in the early 19th century. Gouge means to extort or to swindle. Gouge is also a layer of decomposed rocks or minerals found along walls of a vein. Of course, if we think about the sound of the name, it also links to the verb screw, in this case meaning to exact money, force a lower price, or to oppress. All rather apt for our Ebenezer at the start of the novel. So as we can tell just from Scrooge's name alone, this is a tale about the remarkable transformation of Ebenezer Scrooge. Now this novel was originally published with illustrations. If we have a look at this first illustration by John Leech, we can see Scrooge as a shrivelled, sad-looking figure by a measly fire with just his bowl of gruel beside him. By the end, here he is, a hearty-looking gentleman, a roaring fire, and he's sitting, eating with Bob Cratchit. So the illustrations themselves are an interesting way of charting the change in Scrooge from beginning to end. But let's start with Scrooge in that first stave. Remember, this is a Christmas carol. Carols had become incredibly popular as a form of Christmas entertainment in the early 19th century, and so Dickens mirrors this with the titles of each section of the text. Rather than calling them chapters, he calls them staves, filling that sense of this being a piece of music. When we first meet Scrooge in stave 1, Dickens describes him as being secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. There's lots of sibilance in this quotation, lots of those S sounds that mirror the secrecy. S sounds are often connected with almost a snake-like hissing, and again linking back to biblical allusions, the snake often reminds us of the story of the Garden of Eden and that sense of temptation and sin. So Scrooge is very quickly aligned with a sinful nature through the sibilant sounds at the beginning of the novel. He's very isolated here as well. We've got that simile, solitary as an oyster. We get that sense that he is closed off from everybody. He's almost trapped in his little shell. But of course, as we know, within an oyster shell can be found a pearl. So right from the beginning, Dickens is suggesting potential for change. There is a foreshadowing that we can sense right from the beginning of the text that Scrooge will be this remarkably transformed man by the end. There is a glimmer of hope in this secret and self-contained and solitary, miserable man. But of course, at the beginning of the text, Scrooge is a very miserable man. Scrooge does not like Christmas at the start of the novel. Something has happened in his past and he does not enjoy this time of year. In fact, he says to his nephew Fred, "Every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be buried with a stake of holly through his heart." He's very, very miserly here. Every idiot. He seriously despises people who like Christmas. There's no respect, there's no mirth here. And that sense of being buried with a stake of holly through his heart, there's almost something kind of supernatural, something almost vampire-like. There's no joy, there's no warmth, there's no excitement that Scrooge feels here. And of course, holly is a symbol that crops up time and time again in the novel. If you watch the video on the ghosts, we'll explore that a little bit more. In this first section of the novel, Scrooge's miserly nature is perhaps best seen not when he's talking to his nephew, but when he's talking to the charity collectors. Two charity collectors come into Scrooge's place of work and ask if he will donate, if he will help the poor, as would be his Christian duty, except that Scrooge's response is to ask, are there no prisons and the union workhouses? Now remember, this was at a time when laws had been put in place to ensure that anybody who was in financial need of support from the government, rather than being given any sort of monetary support that we might know is available today, instead people were expected to go to the workhouse. And this was a deeply unpleasant place. Yes, you would be given a roof over your head and you would be given what passed for food, but men and women were separated, families were split apart, hard labour was required, there was no sense of respect, there was no sense of care. It was the workhouses and the prisons were one and the same. And of course, remember, Dickens himself had some personal experience of this. As a child, his father had spent a lot of time in serious debt, and Scrooge himself had spent some of his childhood working in a factory that dealt with making boot polish. Dickens himself had had a very kind of difficult time with poverty in his own childhood. So he knows just how awful the prospect of a prison, a debtor's prison or a workhouse would be for a person in need. And he ensures that Scrooge is so callous that he doesn't care about others. He sees that these systems are put in place, however unpleasant they are, and he expects that people use them. And so as a result, Scrooge lives a very unhappy life. He shuts away from people, he's not willing to spend money on others, or even himself. We see at the end of Scrooge's working day that he took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. Now Dickens repeats the word melancholy there to really emphasise just how pitiful a picture this is, except that we're not 100% encouraged to feel sorry for Scrooge here. We might pity him, but in a way that we recognise the life he's living is not the life that somebody should seek out. Scrooge is so concerned with conserving his money that he won't even allow himself to have the sustenance, the nourishment that will keep him safe, will keep him well and keep him healthy. It's perhaps no wonder that Scrooge is so isolated when he doesn't even care at the beginning of this novel about himself. And it's in the first stanza that Dickens introduces the concept of a ghost. Jacob Marley arrives, at which point Scrooge tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. Even in that very first stanza, where we've seen this miserable, secret, solitary, rude, blustering old man, again we're seeing that potential for change, just like we saw foreshadowed with the solitary as an oyster simile. Here we're seeing that Scrooge is afraid of this ghostly spectre. He cannot fully utter the word humbug that we've already seen him quite freely throw about earlier in the text. He told Fred that Christmas was a humbug. Yet here, when he's faced with the ghost of his former business partner, he cannot fully form that word. He tried to say, and yet he stopped at the first syllable. So again, there's that insinuation of the potential for change. And this potential for change continues throughout the second stave. The second stave is where we meet the ghost of Christmas past and we learn about Scrooge's backstory. The ghost of Christmas past comes and initially takes Scrooge on a visit to see his childhood. And so we meet Scrooge as a schoolboy. And here we're presented with a picture of a lonely boy who was reading near a feeble fire. Not that different to the Scrooge that we saw in Stave 1, that secret, self-contained and solitary person. But here, there is something much more pitiable about this image, a lonely boy. The fact that this is a child, there's a vulnerability here. We've got those fricative sounds of the feeble fire, which almost seem to juxtapose the words themselves. There's a conflict here. Dickens is showing what happens to the people who aren't looked after. And this is an idea that keeps coming up all the way through the text, this sense of duty that we have to look after those less fortunate than ourselves. So we have this very sad image of Scrooge as a child. And this is made even more sad by Scrooge's ecstatic exclamation. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. Scrooge is reading and Scrooge is imagining the characters in the text that he's reading. And the characters are bringing him joy because they are his only friends. That's a terribly, terribly sad idea. This lonely boy, he's there all alone. All the other children have gone home for Christmas. And the only comfort that Scrooge can take is in the characters of books. They're fictitious characters, they're not real, and these are the only things bringing Scrooge joy in his life here. He exclaimed, there's an excitement there. And not only is it just the exclamation, but Dickens includes the fact that it's in ecstasy, it's heightened excitement. And that heightened excitement against the very sad, lonely boy could make the reader feel quite uncomfortable. And that is deliberate. We're supposed to be feeling those same sensations of discomfort that Scrooge feels, because this is, after all, a text with a lesson. And Scrooge shows signs of being able to learn that lesson very early on in this text. Having seen his childhood, having seen how lonely, how miserable he was, Scrooge turns to the ghost and he says, there was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to have given him something. That is all. Very quickly, Scrooge starts to reflect on the error of his ways. That Christmas carol, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, has hit a chord, has struck a nerve in Scrooge's soul, in Scrooge's heart. And already this first ghost is starting to do its job, is starting to bring about that remarkable transformation of Scrooge. And we see this kind of remarkable transformation of the Scrooge watching the scene, contrasted with Scrooge of his past, as we witness the scene of Belle ending their engagement. And as we watch this scene, Dickens tells us that Scrooge's face had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye. Now, often in literature, eyes are thought to be the window to the soul, and this gives us a really, really good insight into Scrooge's soul. It's eager and it's greedy and it's restless and it's full of avarice. 2 of the 7 deadly sins are referenced there. It doesn't take long in Scrooge's life for him to start worshipping those false idols that we saw in the story of the Ebenezer stone, or the start of the story of the Ebenezer stone. Scrooge is far more concerned with that golden idol, money and wealth, than he is with love and family. And we're starting to see at this point a similarity between the Scrooge of the past and the present in a different way to the sad, pitiful image of that lonely boy. No longer do we sense a vulnerability in Scrooge. We sense a selfishness and we sense an unpleasantness that Dickens wants us to criticise, that Dickens wants us to judge. And Dickens ensures that Scrooge feels that critical revulsion as well. He turns to the ghost and he exclaims, "Leave me." He urges the ghost, "Take me back, haunt me no longer." We've got 2 exclamations there. There's an urgency, there's a pain, there's a fear from Scrooge. He is learning this lesson, but he knows that this is only the beginning. Of course, Jacob Marley has told him that 3 spirits will visit him, and this is just the first. He's frightened, he's worried, he's upset, but he's aware of his potential to change. Scrooge's willingness to learn from the spirits continues from stave 2 into stave 3. When the next of the spirits enters his home, Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before this spirit. That adverb timidly helps us understand the change in Scrooge's personality. He's calm, he's willing to change, he's a little bit nervous, And the fact that he hung his head shows a reverence, shows an understanding of the error of his ways, and creates a sense that perhaps Scrooge is starting to repent, starting to feel sorry for the way that he has behaved in his past and in his present. One of the first places that the Ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge to see is the House of Bob Cratchit. And here we see the Cratchit family, and we'll talk more about the Cratchit family in the Cratchits video. But we see more about this family and the poverty in which they live and represent. And we see Tiny Tim, one of the Cratchit children, who is quite clearly very ill, very frail, very vulnerable. And here Dickens writes, "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." Now that's an imperative sentence there, tell me. Scrooge is desperate to know the answer. And that imperative sentence works well with the interest he had never felt before. Something is changing in Scrooge's heart here. He's learning that it's not okay to be solitary as an oyster. It's not okay to be self-contained, that we need people around us, we need family, and the Cratchits are allowing him to realise that, are allowing him to understand the importance of family. But instead of answering Scrooge in a clear manner, the ghost repeats Scrooge's own words of stave 1 back to him. Instead of giving Scrooge comfort, the ghost merely says, well, if Tiny Tim is to die, it's population control. And of course that's what Scrooge had been arguing in the first stanza, a very cold, very unfeeling, very, very shocking sentiment for readers to experience. And again, Scrooge hung his head. We're seeing that repentance over and over again now. He was overcome with penitence and grief. Scrooge cannot believe that these words were his own, and he deeply regrets the things that he said. Of course, that grief and that regret will have been made all the more painful when he hears what people think of him. Watching the Cratchits, watching their party, Bob encourages the family to toast to Scrooge, who is at least allowing them to have this feast, albeit very meagre. But of course, Mrs. Cratchit isn't so willing to praise her husband's boss. Instead, she declares him an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man. Now, we know in writing that often if we're writing a list, we will use 3 words. But here, Dickens extends that. We've got 4 different descriptions of Scrooge. He's odious, he's stingy, he's hard, he's unfeeling. There's too much hateful behaviour from Scrooge to be condensed into just the optimum 3 adjectives. Such is Scrooge's loathsomeness that 3 words is not enough here. Such is Mrs. Cratchit's hatred for Scrooge and the way he treats her husband and her family as a result. And it's not just Mrs. Cratchit who feels this way. The ghost takes Scrooge to witness Fred, his nephew's Christmas party, the party that he turned down an invite to in stave 1. And here the guests again talk about the subject of Scrooge, where it is declared his wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. And here we've got this reminder. Dickens is giving Scrooge and the reader a reminder of our Christian duty to help others less fortunate than ourselves. And that is shown to Scrooge time and time again throughout the text. It's not enough that they just talk about the fact that he doesn't share his wealth, He doesn't even use it for himself. We've seen that he only eats a melancholy dinner in a melancholy tavern. He barely has a fire to keep himself warm. But again, he's described in deeply unpleasant terms by those who are close to him and who potentially know him the best. Among Fred's party, we see a description of Scrooge as a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted. He is conveyed during party games as something that is not even human. He's more of a beast. And of course, for these characters who've seen Scrooge, who aren't aware of the transformation that is taking place in his heart and his mind, this is a very fitting description. He is savage, he is ruthless. He growls bah humbug at people. He barely makes conversation, he's self-contained. Of course he's much more like an animal than a human. He doesn't even treat himself as a human. And this would be deeply shocking for Scrooge. Yet against that, because of this transformation that is taking place within Scrooge, he is able to learn to keep that penitence and grief in his mind so that he is taken with the spirit of Christmas. As he watches the games being played at Fred's, he almost tries to join in, forgetting that he's just an outside observer that nobody can see. And Dickens writes, Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart. What I find really interesting in this quotation is the fact that he's described as Uncle Scrooge. Here, Dickens is allowing him that connection to family that has perhaps been missing for many years of his life. The last time we really saw any sort of sense of Scrooge appreciating family was in Stave 2, in his childhood, when Fan comes to collect him to take him home, because his father is no longer the horrible man that he used to be. Again, a foreshadowing of change, a sense that it is possible, it's in the family, it's in his DNA. And we're seeing that the misery, the melancholy atmosphere that lived in Scrooge's heart is lifting. More and more change takes place as the novel progresses. But we end this stave on a very bleak tone. The spirit shows Scrooge ignorance and want to helpless children within his care. And Scrooge is appalled at the sight of these children. He's deeply, deeply shocked. They're very wretched. There's nothing of them. Their fingers and their hands and their feet are more like claws than they are like human body parts. And Scrooge asks the ghost if there is help. He cries, have they no refuge or resource? The fact that that tag is cried, the verb is cried, shows the desperation of Scrooge, shows the enormity of the change, shows his sorrow. But once again, the spirit turns Scrooge's words back on him. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit. And that's a really, really chilling moment. There's no adjective for how the spirit says it. It's very simple. And it's a very simple sentiment. And that's all that Scrooge needs at this point. Dickens knows he doesn't need any of the lavish adjectives or descriptions or similes or metaphors that he writes so brilliantly. Simplicity is all that Scrooge needs, because he's really receptive and willing to learn this final message. And so, by the time the final spirit comes, Scrooge is prepared. He knows what he must do. And when this spirit arrives, Scrooge says to him, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But I know your purpose is to do me good. and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company and do it with a thankful heart. Scrooge is now taking control of the narrative. He understands what this spirit is here to do. He recognises its purpose, its teaching, and he's ready and willing to listen. With the previous two spirits, Scrooge has asked questions, but here Scrooge acknowledges that he must listen, he must watch, and he must learn. And what this spirit shows us are perhaps the most unpleasant, the most disturbing, the most painful things for Scrooge to witness. The spirit shows Scrooge a group of businessmen, people that he knew, people that he had worked with, discussing a dead man and musing on what will come of his burial. And one of them says it's likely to be a very cheap funeral. And if we take Scrooge from the first stave, that's perhaps not surprising, is it? We've talked about the fact that he had a melancholy dinner, that he didn't give money to charity, he didn't use his own money for himself. So of course he's not likely to spend money on his death. But for Scrooge, who's had these visits from two previous ghosts, who's got his thankful heart willing to learn and open to the lessons of the spirits, this would be a very unsettling thing to hear. And of course, it's not just people talking about how cheap his funeral is. The spirit shows him people who have gone and stripped his house bare, even of the curtains around his bed. He didn't give in life, so why should people not take in his death? Nobody cares about his death. They're only willing to go to the funeral if there's going to be a decent spread of food to come. And this was very, very shocking to Scrooge. He's shocked by the prospect of Tiny Tim's death. He's shocked by the revelation that this dead man that has been robbed, that is not really mourned, but is just an opportunity for a free lunch at a funeral, is himself. The spirit points to that grave and it's got Ebenezer Scrooge's name on it. And Scrooge declares, I am not the man I was. Scrooge acknowledges the change that has taken place because of these spirits' visits. He knows that he must live to be another man. At the beginning of the stave, he hoped that that would be true. By the end of the stave, he is confident that that is true. It's a declarative sentence. It's a declaration. It's a fact in his mind. And to show just how much he means that, he declares, I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, present and the future. Scrooge is going to carry these messages with him. The past will not sit in the past. The present will not be isolated. He will be thinking about the future. All of these things will work together to ensure that his heart, his mind, his soul are rounded, are caring, are compassionate. The charity that comes at Christmas time will be there all the year round. This is perhaps thus far the greatest declaration of change that Dickens allows us to see. So that by the final stave of the text, when all the spirits have disappeared, Scrooge wakes up thrilled that it's Christmas morning. He's so excited that he hasn't missed it. He opens up his window and he shouts a Merry Christmas to everybody. It's an exclamation. Dickens shows us how excited Scrooge is, that he can honour Christmas in his heart, that he can be true to his word. And he declares to passers-by and anybody who will listen, I am quite a baby. And of course that is quite an interesting line in reminding us that Scrooge has almost been reborn. This is a chance to start again. He has been restored to the pure, hopeful, fresh person that he once was, that he's had the potential to be and is now willing to be. He is quite a baby. And so he is good on his word. He calls down to a boy in the street, "Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there?" Not the little prize turkey, the big one. And of course, nowadays, we tend to think of turkey as the standard Christmas bird, and a goose is much more kind of reserved for more expensive dining tables, where in the Victorian times it was quite the reverse. Goose was what was cheap and turkey was what was expensive. And here Scrooge is really willing to buy the biggest turkey, to spend as much money as necessary to buy this prize turkey. And as we then find out, this turkey is to go to the Cratchit family. So he is honouring this notion of charity in his heart. And that notion of charity is then seen when he bumps into those two charity collectors from Stave 1 in the streets. And when he's in conversation with these two men, he says, "That's my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you." He recognises the reputation that he has built for himself, and he understands that that is a part of his past that he can leave behind. And Dickens writes here, Scrooge whispered in his ear. And this is where Scrooge declares that he will be donating some money to their charitable cause. Now, what's interesting is that Dickens doesn't reveal how much Scrooge is giving. And perhaps that is a true sign of just how much Scrooge has learnt. He knows he must use his money for good, but he also knows he must not make a song and dance of it. He must use his money for good, but not for advancing himself at the same time. And so there's a secrecy to Scrooge and his behaviour, but a secrecy that is very different to that secret, self-contained man that we saw in Stave 1. Here, he understands that charity is between him and God, and that it's very sacred. And his understanding of his relationship with God extends to the fact he went to church. The carol, "God Rest You Merry Gentlemen," that was sung at the beginning of the novel is now fully ingratiated into his soul. He goes to church. We've seen the repentance, we've seen that word penitence in previous staves, and here again Scrooge is honouring Christmas in his heart. He's being true to the promises he made to the spirits, and he's going to seek forgiveness. He's going to seek guidance for how he can ensure his change lasts forever. And Dickens tells us that that happens. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. That repetition of the adjective good over and over and over ensures that we understand that this change in Scrooge is permanent, that it has taken place, and those promises that he made to the Spirit will stay with him forever. So if we think about the purpose of Scrooge, we see that transformation. We saw the images at the start of this revision session from Stave 1 to Stave 5. We see that Scrooge's transformation from malevolence to benevolence allows us to understand the importance of social responsibility. As we saw with Leech's illustrations, once Scrooge becomes a benevolent member of society, using his wealth for good, the quality of his life vastly improves. And this suggests that parsimonious, greedy attitudes to wealth are not desired in Victorian society. Through this change, Dickens shows the reader it is never too late to redeem yourself of despicable behaviour, Redemption is open to all who seek it.